The image that most people have of it is a majority, which is small animal clinical veterinarians, people who work with people's pets. That is what most people imagine, but it is quite a bit broader than that. In some ways, being a veterinarian is similar to being a pediatrician. You take care of a patient who can't necessarily articulate or even understand their own needs. Traditionally, veterinary medicine has been a vocation. People come to it because they have a particular passion for it. Loving animals is the common thread, and there's nobody in the profession, at least in the companion animal side, who doesn't feel that way. So I would say that is a necessary but not sufficient condition for going into the profession.
The lives of humans and animals are deeply intertwined, from the pets who share our homes to the farm animals that feed us, and the wild creatures that captivate our imagination. There exists a special bond. This bond is not just about companionship or sustenance, it's about a shared journey on this planet. It goes beyond shared walks and cuddles and amusement, extending into a deep commitment to their health and happiness. The guardians who dedicate their lives to ensuring that all creatures big and small are well taken care of and live healthy and happy lives are veterinarians. My guest today is Dr. Brennen McKenzie, a small animal general practice veterinarian, an author, and director of veterinary medicine for Loyal, a San Francisco-based biotechnology company researching aging and therapies to improve the lifespan of dogs. Dr. McKenzie is not only a trained veterinarian from University of Pennsylvania School of Veterinary Medicine, he also holds a master's degree in physiology and animal behavior, and has worked for several years in environmental and behavioral enrichment of captive primates. In addition to his clinical work, he has served as a president of Evidence-Based Veterinary Medicine Association, lectured on evidence-based medicine in various veterinary conferences, published journals in his field, and contributes to a monthly column for Veterinary Practice News magazine. Dr. McKenzie has continued to pursue his wide range of interests and has a postgraduate degree in epidemiology from London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and teaches veterinary students in his practice, as well as undergraduate biology majors. Today, he's joining me to share the world of veterinary medicine and how to build a profession in this field. This is Career Calling, and I'm your host, Pratibha Pandit. Hi, Brennan. Welcome to Career Calling.
Hi, thanks for having me.
I'm really looking forward to learning about the world of animals and the medicine associated with it. This is one of the professions that is probably widely known and probably desired by a lot of the kids as well. But I want to hear from you, from the expert. How would you describe your profession?
So the thing about veterinary medicine is it's quite varied profession. The image that most people have of it is a majority, which is small animal clinical veterinarians, people who work with people's pets, and we take care of dogs and cats and rabbits and rodents and all manner of creatures for people who have them as members of their family. And that is what most people imagine, and that's what a lot, probably about 75, 80% of us do. But it is quite a bit broader than that. There are obviously people who work in food animal production, so working with agricultural animals, cows, and pigs and sheep and that sort of thing. There are people who work in public health. There are quite a few veterinarians who are involved in the public health field and who work essentially with humans or with human-related health issues that also involve animals, because there's a lot of potential there for diseases to cross back and forth, and obviously because of the food supply. There are people who work with exotic creatures and wildlife and zoo animals and who do laboratory research. So there are really quite a lot of different pathways that you can go other than the fairly traditional clinical small animal vet, which is what I do.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's very interesting, because my early memories of hearing about a veterinary doctor was back in India. In rural areas in India is where mostly veterinarians were seen, which is dairy, animals, cattle, right? Cattle, cows, who are mainly there to produce milk and milk products, not to eat. And you would hear veterinaries in that context. And urban areas, you will hear probably the pets, home pets, maybe
Mhm.
dogs and cats and maybe birds, nothing more in
Yeah.
context. So I always have wondered, how do you treat an animal that cannot speak and so many varied animals that may have completely different physiologies, right? Like from, especially in the Western context, there are so many different animals that are kept as pet. So I'm very curious to learn about that. Is there a specialization per type of animal, or how do you do that?
It is interesting because in some ways, being a veterinarian is similar to being a pediatrician, right? You have a
Mhm.
responsibility to your patient, but you take care of a patient who can't necessarily articulate or even understand their own needs and their own interests and their own health conditions. And so you work with their caregiver in order to understand what the needs are and then to try to get those needs met. In many ways, and we'll probably come back to this, communication is a really important part of the job because you spend a lot of your time working with the humans who care for the animals that you're also taking care of.
Hmm.
In terms of the variety of species, it is quite a challenge. I like to say real doctors work on more than one species. I make fun of our physician colleagues sometimes because the degree of specialization is really amazing. I was explaining to a client once about his dog's ruptured ACL ligament in his knee and why he needed surgery. My client chuckled because he's an orthopedic surgeon. And after 4 years of medical school and 8 years of residency, his entire career is 6 surgical procedures on the human knee. That's how specialized sometimes our colleagues in human medicine get. Whereas, as I said, I see dogs and cats and rabbits and rodents, and that's a pretty limited range. I don't see reptiles or birds or horses, and some vets will see every animal under the sun.
Uh-huh.
And I do outpatient care. I do surgery. I do chemotherapy. I do imaging. So we play a lot of different roles. And there is some degree of specialization, but only about 15% of vets go on and get a board certification in a specialty. So there are veterinary cardiologists, veterinary dentists, veterinary oncologists, but it's definitely the minority. And that's part of the economic reality of what we do, of course, that people have to pay for our services. And the more specialized we get, the more expensive medicine gets, as we're seeing in human medicine. And it's just not realistic in veterinary medicine to go down that road. So, yeah, we do get the challenge, both the positive and negative challenge of having to work with a tremendous variety of different kinds of animals and circumstances.
Mhm. You mentioned some people will only see reptiles. Is that a specialization? Is that your own decision of what kind of animals you want to see, or is there a regulation on that?
No, any veterinarian who is licensed to practice in whatever state in the US or province in Canada that they're licensed can technically practice on any species.
Mhm.
However, we do tend to specialize because most of us realize that you can't do everything and do it effectively. Some people will choose a particular species area because they have an interest in that. If they have an agricultural background, they may want to work with farm animals. There are plenty of horse lovers or cat lovers who just like to work with that species because that's what they care about. That's their passion. It also depends a little on where you are. If you are the only veterinarian in a rural town, you're
Hmm.
likely to have to work with a lot of different species. I have a colleague who practices in a small town in Missouri, and the rules for animal ownership are quite relaxed there. So she treats dogs and cats and horses and sheep, but she treats monkeys and tigers and all sorts
Oh.
of exotic animals because she's the only vet in town and people have those animals in
Mhm.
their as owners. Whereas where I am in a more suburban setting, it's a bit more limited and traditional, so I don't have to have quite that range.
Mhm. And is that maybe it's a little bit digressing, but I think it's interesting. Are there regulation on what kind of animals one can have as pet in different areas?
Absolutely, yes. There are guidelines both at the federal and at the state level, and as many things in the U.S. are, there's a great deal of variation and inconsistency from one state to the next, and that tends to be where most of that level of regulation occurs. So in California, for example, occasionally people will bring me a ferret to treat, but ferrets are not legally ownable as pets here, so they're always concerned about getting in trouble for that. Whereas I worked with a colleague in Texas where ferrets are a fairly common pet and they see them all the time. So there is some variability based on what people are allowed to own as well.
Mhm. Yeah, makes sense. You talked a little bit about the different work settings or different career paths. I want to first touch a little bit upon the work settings. It may be my ignorance, but
I have mostly seen private practices or the clinics, veterinary clinics, but not hospitals, for example. I just want to understand what are the different work settings a veterinary, doctor can be employed in.
Yes, again, quite varied. So the majority of us are in companion animal practice. We treat people's pets, and most people are either in a clinic, which is generally defined as a facility that is open certain hours but doesn't have 24-hour staffing, or in a hospital that has 24-hour staffing. That will vary a little bit. There's some division between day practices that see mostly healthier or outpatient cases and emergency practices that are open on weekends and nights and see emergencies. Some will do both. The typical small animal, companion animal veterinarian will work in a clinic or a hospital in a variety of those sorts of settings. But there are also specialists. So there are specialty hospitals that do more advanced things. So a radiation oncologist will probably work in a specialty hospital. There are university hospitals. So people who are at the highest level of specialization and who also do research and teaching will work at a veterinary college, university hospital. There are government veterinarians. A lot of them are in the armed forces. So my friend is a veterinarian in the Army. And in addition to her private practice work, she will be deployed overseas and often do agricultural work or do food safety work for the military when she's over there, or public health services. The NIH and CDC and some of the public health agencies employ veterinarians who do research on communicable disease or on animal diseases. I have another colleague who spent a lot of time in Africa working on Ebola and some of the other diseases spread from animals to humans there. So quite a bit of variability. The traditional image of the vet in the vet clinic that sees the dogs and cats is probably the majority. But again, lots of opportunities and options.
Where are the veterinary hospitals? Are they part of the big hospitals or are they separate? This could be completely my ignorance, but I haven't
Yeah,
come across many hospitals like that.
there are private practice hospitals. And again, that depends a little bit on the location. Here in the Bay Area where I work, because it's a relatively affluent area, we are likely to have 24-hour, 7-day-a-week practices that can have veterinarians on staff at all times. In smaller towns where maybe there are only one or two veterinarians available, that's less common. And so people will work day hours and then there'll be an emergency hospital in the next town or somewhere where they refer. And then the largest hospitals, of course, are at the universities. There are, I believe, currently 25 veterinary schools in the United States, and most of them have their own university hospital, and they will be adjacent to general medical college facilities, but obviously separate from the human medicine facility.
That's great. What about the education path itself? Are there licensures or how does it work? And if you could also contrast with maybe the human doctors, like what does that path look like? We all know that it is a very long path for somebody to become a doctor. Let's talk about what are the beginnings, like undergrad level or even before, and what are the education paths? How does it progress?
Yeah, it varies from country to country. So in the United States, the path is you're required to do a bachelor's degree first before you can be admitted to a veterinary college. So there's a 4-year undergraduate degree. And then veterinary school is another 4-year postgraduate degree. And most veterinarians, probably about 75, 80%, will go into clinical practice or research or whatever field they go into directly from vet school. About 15 or 20% will end up in specialty practice. So you go through an internship, which is a 1-year internship. And then you go through a residency, which will depend on what you do. Surgery residencies may be 3 or 4 years. Some other specialties may have shorter residency paths. For most of us, it ends up being about 8 years of university level education. But it can be a little bit longer if you end up in an academic research specialty, for example. There are also dual DVM PhD programs. So people who know that their focus is research will go into a program that's typically about 6 or 8 years and will come out with both a veterinary degree and a PhD. Now, in other countries, the path is a little different. So in the UK, for example, the veterinary degree is an undergraduate degree. So you will go directly from secondary school into typically a 5-year, what's called a BVSC or Bachelor in Veterinary Science program. The pathway is a little bit more directed from an earlier stage and shorter. People will end up going into practice earlier. And then the possibility for internship and residency is still available there.
What about the board certifications and licenses that you need to have? How does that work? And are there separate exams for that?
Yes, depends on the jurisdiction. So again, in the United States, there is a general national licensing exam. that you take when you graduate. And then in the past, there have been state exams, which were entirely separate and often quite varied from one to the other and different. I've been in practice about 23 years now, and things have changed quite a bit. So most of the time now, the national exam is all that's required for state licensure, and the state exams are simply specific to some of the legal practices in that particular state. So veterinarians are usually regulated by a veterinary medical board, just as physicians are regulated by a medical board, and that's on a state level. And the Veterinary Medical Practice Act in a given state will have some specific legal requirements. So most of the time, you'll now take a national licensing exam, and then you'll just take a state jurisprudence exam to make sure you're familiar with the legal context in the particular state you want to practice.
During your veterinary study, do you study like a variety of animals? What's the spectrum covered during that time?
So it varies a little bit from school to school. The general pathway is that the first year or two is taken up with a lot of basic sciences. You'll do microbiology, biochemistry, physiology, anatomy, very basic science level courses. And then gradually, at a different pace, depending on which school you're at, you will get into more clinically focused courses, which often will focus on particular species or subgroups of animals. So the anatomy, for example, it covers most of the common species. So you'll work with dogs and cats, horses, small ruminants, and cattle to some extent. Some places may have exotic animals, reptiles, rodents, things like that in there, but those are the basics. Once you get into clinical practice, then some schools allow a degree of specialization. So you may be able to specialize if you're a small animal track, for example, you'll probably focus mostly on dogs and cats in your clinical preparation. If you're a food animal production, you may focus on pigs and cows or poultry, different areas within that, exotics. So there are some schools that will allow greater or lesser degrees of specialization. Where I went to school, for example, once I began my clinical training in my third year, it was mostly focused on small animal because I decided that's what I was going to be doing. But I did have about 8 weeks of mandatory clinical rotations through the large animal facilities, working with both food animals and with horses.
That sounds like then it is also very important to pick your school based on your interest. Is that how it works? Like when you want to go into veterinary, you want to go into a school that is focused on a certain area?
That's the ideal, but I will say that veterinary school is very competitive. And so the general practice is people apply to many schools. And if you're fortunate to have choices, then you can start making those kind of distinctions. When I went to the University of Pennsylvania School of Veterinary Medicine as an out-of-state student, the acceptance rates for out-of-state students was 3%. It was very difficult to get in. There are a lot fewer veterinary schools and a lot more people who want to do that. So the acceptance rates are much lower than for most of the human medical professions. And so frequently people don't have as much choice as they would like to have about which school they go to. Finances also play a role, of course. If you go to a school that is in a state you're a resident of, or a public school rather than a private school, tuition's a lot less. Currently, student loan burdens are extraordinarily high in veterinary medicine. When I graduated, I had something in the range of about $160,000 in loans, and I was in the top 5%. That's not even the median for students today. It's well over $200,000 now. A lot of people have to incorporate that into their decision-making as well.
Yeah. When I was doing my research, that's the big chatter that I found online about the student loan burden and how to make it viable after that. We'll come back to that. But before I go more deep into the education and the post-education processes, I wanted to hear about your journey. How did you decide this is your profession? Or when is the first time you discovered it? And then what has been your journey so far?
So my path is a winding one and probably the exception rather than the rule. Oddly enough, I did a career profile as a senior in high school and I chose veterinary medicine. I don't know why. I had absolutely no thought of being a veterinarian and it never occurred to me again for many years. I am interested in almost everything. So as an undergraduate, I was a double major in English literature and biology. And my initial thought was I wanted to be the crocodile hunter. I wanted to do wildlife biology and jump out of helicopters onto wild animals and that kind of adventurous animal-centered career. I eventually I did a master's degree in animal behavior and worked with primates. And I had come to the point where my dream was to be the next Jane Goodall and to go to the field and do primate research.
Mhm.
That proved a challenging career path because, like many academic disciplines, primate behavior doesn't generate marketable products. And as a consequence, the market is small, the resources are few. And after quite a number of years of trying to make a living as a primatologist, I was getting to 30 and getting ready to have kids, and I'd never had a real job.
Mhm.
And it seemed like it was time maybe that I got a real job. So I had been running a primate facility and worked with some veterinarians there. And what they did working with primates was different from the traditional veterinary path, but it seemed like an interesting profession for me because it ticked a lot of the boxes. It was intellectually challenging. It was something that I felt had some value to society. Whether you did research or took care of people's pets, it had some purpose. And it was a practical way of making a living, which I had finally begun to realize was a consideration. So I was doing primate research and I happened to apply to veterinary school from that perspective. And I went to vet school with probably about 75 or 80% of our class who had been, as I call them, the James Harriets. They'd read the books and thought about being vets for their whole life since they were kids. And then about 20% of us had a variety of backgrounds. We had a stockbroker and a lawyer and a geneticist and people who'd done other things. And I think there are advantages to that kind of path. I think a lot of the folks who had dreamt of nothing else their whole life were a little disappointed by the fact that, like any job, you have your bad days and some things about it are difficult and unpleasant. And it's not nirvana when you get there, even though you've been working towards it since you were 8 or 9. And so I think there are some advantages to coming to it late, which is how I came to it. I also think people sometimes think that once you become a veterinarian, that's the end of the career path. Things stop there. But of course, that's not true either. I've done almost 25 years of clinical practice, but I recently, about 5 years ago, did a master's in epidemiology. I'm interested in research. I now split my time between clinical work and research. Book for pet owners. There are lots of things you can do with that skill set and that background besides what you imagine is the traditional path.
Mhm. Yeah, that's something that I noticed interesting, the epidemiology degree that you have. Is it specific to the animals or it's a general for the general
No, I
population?
did it through the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, which is a human public health school. So it's a
Okay.
general degree. And for me, I've always had an interest in the relationship between scientific research and clinical practice because clinical medicine is based on the research done by basic scientists. But often clinicians aren't scientists. We're technicians. We're used to taking that information and just doing things, practical things in the real world to solve problems. But we don't always think enough about where does the foundation of that come from and when is the research reliable or not reliable?
Mhm.
How do we know what we know? How much confidence can we have in the things that we offer our clients? And
Mhm.
my interest in that led me into a domain called evidence-based medicine, which is about bringing clinical practice and research science together. And the master's was a way for me to really dig into that and understand a little better the foundations behind clinical practices that I engage
Mhm. That's very interesting. Another thing that struck me when you mentioned, and also when I was doing research, I came across actually quite a few questions or chatter about people in their 30s, 40s, doing something else, wanting to go back to veterinary school. So I was going to ask you, is that a common thing that you noticed? And I'm curious why that is, because I did come across quite a few discussions about that.
I think, and I'm not an expert in this area, but I will say I think that in general, career change is a more common and acceptable thing than it has been in the past. And so I know an awful lot of people who've had several seemingly superficially very different careers, though there's usually a connection or a link from one to the other. I do a lot of writing and I was a literature major in college, and that seems unconnected with science and medicine. Of course, I write a lot about science, and so they do link up. I don't know that I see a lot of people coming to veterinary medicine that late. I was 31 when I started vet school, so I was about 8 years older than most of my colleagues at that point. And that was unusual. There were a handful of us. And I think it's still unusual. Most of the new graduates that I see today that I train in vet school have come traditionally straight from undergraduate into veterinary medicine. I think because it's a very long path. What I will say is I'm seeing a lot more of the other, which is that rather than simply practicing for 40 years and retiring, a lot more veterinarians get to a point in their career, 15, 20, some odd years in, where they want to try something different. And that may be an entirely different field, but often it's a different variant of the veterinary field, going into research, going into practice ownership, going into some other domain that makes use of the same knowledge base and skill set. So I do feel like I see more of that now.
Yeah, maybe it is possible that this is the demographic because it is a big change. They are trying to understand more, and that's why they come to the internet to find out more. That's why probably you'll see
Could be.
possible too. Another thing that you mentioned as well, and usually you see, and this is not very, I wouldn't say very specific to veterinary. Most of the times you will see people talking about the first break into any field, right? From education to transitioning into workforce. What I see in veterinary area is also this fear or lack of confidence about this being, there are higher burn rates, the profession is difficult, it is a lot of hours, and then coming out of college with a lot of student loan burden, the financial viability of it, there is a lot of chatter and nervousness around it. So I wanted to get your view on, one, what is the things that one should be very aware of before getting into this profession, and what are the ways they can strategize to make it a successful run?
I think there are practical aspects to that question and also psychological aspects. So from a practical point of view, you do have to recognize that you will put a lot of time and intellectual energy into training, and that training will probably have a high financial cost. And the return on that investment from a purely financial point of view is going to be a lot less than it would be in comparable fields. If you go into dentistry or you go into human medicine, there are a lot of other fields where you can get roughly the same amount of training, do a very similar sort of thing, and get paid a lot more. And that's just something people need to realize. And traditionally, veterinary medicine has been a vocation. People come to it because they have a particular passion for it. And if that's how you feel and where you're starting, I think that's a reasonable thing for you to do with your life. But you do have to recognize practical realities, that it's challenging work. And from a financial point of view, you can make an argument that it's not always the best choice. Now, I'll say the other side of that, which I think plays into this discussion that we are constantly having in the profession, is that a lot of veterinarians, because it's a vocation, it is their identity more than it is their profession. A lot of people have always wanted to do this, and they identify being a veterinarian with their sense of self-worth and with their overall personhood. And when you have a bad day at something that is an expression of who you are as a person, that has a much harder impact than when you have a bad day at something that you view as just your work, just something that you do to be paid, right? So I think a lot of veterinarians come in expecting to give everything to the profession and it to be the centerpiece of their life. And that's hard. That's difficult. And it's difficult when you then try to balance that with all the other things about being a person, having relationships, having children, having other experiences in your life. One of the advantages that I feel like I had as someone coming by a circuitous route later in life to this was I was already married in vet school. My daughter was born halfway through my clinical year. And there were other things that were important to me that I could focus on besides my career. And while I've been fortunate to have a very successful career, it hasn't been wrapped up with my identity in the same way that I've seen with some of my colleagues. So yeah, I think people, and I don't want to discourage people from going to the profession because I think it's a rich and rewarding field, but I do feel like a lot of people are having trouble staying in the profession because they are struggling with the financial aspects of it, with the emotional burden of it. It's stressful to do things that are really of great importance to people, to members of their family that aren't always successful. Medicine is always hard. And the social media environment is challenging because people who are unhappy with you will trumpet that across the internet loudly, and you'll have to face that. The bad reviews and the hate mail will come in. I also would argue that I think there are some generational shifts. The generation before mine, the boomers, were often approaching veterinary medicine from an entrepreneurial perspective. They wanted to own a practice and have a business and be part of the community in that sense. And people in my sort of Gen X group were more likely to see it as a profession, as a job, and wanted to balance that against having a family and having a personal life. And that's part of the reason why I think there's more corporate ownership of veterinary practices now, because fewer of us wanted to take on that entrepreneurial aspect of it. And I think the generation coming after mine has yet again a slightly different view of the relationship between their life and their work. And I think that generation is still negotiating how they're going to do this job in a different way that fits their current values and ideas about work and person.
Yeah, that is absolutely makes sense, because it is the same thing even in the technology field. Every generation has had a different relationship with their career. So definitely I can relate to that. Coming back to the different career paths that is possible with veterinary practice, can you give a little bit more insight into how can one go about into different career paths? What are those? You have touched upon it, but I wanted to get a little bit of more understanding on how does that work? Is it that
Mhm.
it is you do a few years of practice and then you go into it, or give a little bit of insight into?
I think the traditional straightforward path is you do your 4 years of veterinary school. Somewhere during that time, you choose your general practice area, companion animal medicine, production agriculture, or equine medicine, whatever it may be. And then you graduate, you find a job in that. It's a little bit more common now for people to do internships, which is a bit of a transition. So you spend a year working as a doctor, but in a context where you have some training and mentorship. And I think that's getting to be a little more common. And often that also then creates connections through which you can find a long-term position.
Mhm.
And then most veterinarians go to work for someone. In the past, that's been usually a private practice. The average practice had 2 or 3 veterinarians and was privately owned. There's a dramatic shift going on right now where practices are being bought up by corporations. And so more and more people in the future are likely to work for large practice chains that own dozens or hundreds of practices across the country, which will, of course, always have some advantages and disadvantages in terms of mobility and things like that. Alternatively, if you are interested in research or in teaching or in a specialty, then what a lot of people will do is go straight from veterinary school into an academic internship rather than a private practice internship. And that academic internship will hopefully then lead them into a residency in whatever specialty area they're interested in. And that tends to be, again, where you start to pick which schools have the mentors and expertise in that particular area that you want to follow. Most specialists will practice in academia and will be teachers and researchers, but a growing number of them will also be in specialty private practice. So it's more and more common for people to go to a veterinary cardiologist or a veterinary dermatologist in their area, particularly in larger cities or more affluent areas where people are able to afford those services. It's getting more common for people to go that route. Probably the least common routes will be things like industry. There are a number of companies that develop drugs and other medical products for the veterinary field, and some veterinarians will work in those areas doing clinical studies or drug development. There are a small number who go to the armed services, and again, many of them will do public health or safety and health fields that are related to the relationship between animal and human health. So there are a few other smaller tracks. We like to joke that there's about 1 job a year for vets to work in zoos. So everybody wants to work with the exotic animals because they're so cool. But
Mhm.
that's one of the hardest ways to get into the
Okay.
profession. So there are a few other paths, but most people will end up in private practice,
Mhm.
typically general practice.
Mhm. You mentioned about research a couple of times. I'm curious, what are the areas, like where is the focus leading into where we are now? Like, where's the future headed? What are the areas of research that is gaining attention?
I always have to warn people, and they may not realize this, that veterinary medicine is the poor country cousin of human medicine. So the scale of resources available and of research and evidence available for us is dramatically smaller.
Mm.
And so when I talk about research, we're still at a point where we're trying to get some fairly basic epidemiological data to understand what diseases occur in which kind of animals. Many people are familiar with some of these long-term studies in humans, like the Framingham study or the Nurses' Health study, where people have been followed for 30 or 40 years in large numbers. And those have been really important for us to understand how diseases develop and what we should be doing preventatively. There are only there's only one study like that's ever been done in veterinary medicine. So when I say research, a lot of it is very specific to particular diseases, trying to understand the causes and find treatments for particular common diseases. There is, as I also said, a bit of a niche in industry where people can work on developing new vaccines or new medications. I'm in an interesting field. I work for a biotechnology company that's developing medications specifically to try to target aging and extend healthy lifespan in dogs. And so
Hmm.
we're trying to take some of the basic research information that's been developed over the last 40 years, largely in rodents, but in a few other species, including dogs as well, and start turning that into preventative therapies. I'm likely to see that as a key component of the future because, of course, that's the area that I'm working in and that I'm interested in. So there are a few little niches like that as well. But most researchers will focus on particular disease problems in their area of interest in cardiology or cancer medicine or whatever area they go into.
Interesting. Now, we talked about the educational aspect of it. I'm very curious on your thoughts. One of the things that I notice is a lot of the people may become interested in when they're young, when they're kids in high school, interested in to become veterinarian because they love animals or they have pets and they like pets. But being a doctor could be so much different than having your pet where you're playing with the pet. It's like kids, right? When you're visiting somebody who has a kid versus you are the parent. So
Absolutely.
there's such a difference in the way you interact and work with the pets. So I want to know, is loving animals enough to become a veterinarian? Like what other personality traits and things that one should be aware of?
Loving animals is the common thread, and there's nobody in the profession, at least in the companion animal side, who doesn't feel that way. So I would say that is a necessary but not sufficient condition for going into the profession. What I think people are only beginning to understand, the most recent generation of graduates has a better handle on this than I think mine did, is that the vast majority of your work is with humans. You spend far more time talking to people than you do interacting with the animals. And you spend far more time with the nuances of communicating about science in a difficult context. People on a bad day where a member of their family is unwell, and you have to get people to do things that are scary, that they don't always understand thoroughly, that are expensive to a member of their family. And that involves building trust, building rapport, communicating effectively. And those are all skills that have very little to do with interacting with animals. And so I think that it's becoming a little more common to make sure that people understand that at an early stage, because a lot of veterinarians in the past have come into the profession and really don't enjoy spending time interacting with people, especially in a tense, high pressure situation. And that's a lot of what the job is. So I think it's a little more common now for people to understand that. But loving animals is absolutely required, but you have to have really good communication skills. You have to have really good time management skills. I think you have to, what one of my early mentors said to me that's never gone away is, what we actually do for a living is make decisions. We talk to people and we make decisions. A lot of the technical skills, veterinary students are very concerned about mastering the technical skills, surgery, blood draws, placing catheters. That ends up being a fairly small percentage of what you do. But taking in information, understanding its relevance to the problem in front of you and making a rational decision in a very short amount of time with high stakes is a lot of what we do. And that's an aspect of the profession that I think is hard to train for if you, by nature, don't have a personality that makes you able to be comfortable with that. And so that's something that I always like to stress, is that it is not a laid back profession for most people. It's a pretty high pressure, situation. On average, you'll have 15 or 20 minutes to see a patient. And as I said, you're going to be a cardiologist and a dermatologist and a surgeon and a lot of things. And you're going to switch tasks very rapidly all day long. You get sick of hearing your own name called out at you all day long. So I think that's important for people to recognize. At the end of the day, you still get patients who come in that are adorable and that love to see you. You get to watch them throughout their life cycle, from being puppies to being old dogs or cats. And that's a really rewarding part of it. So people can't lose sight of that. But I think it's more common now for people to understand that that's not enough. That's just one element.
That's amazing. That's such a important aspect to realize, and it is there for every profession. There is some aspect of the personality or the reality versus the imagination that is important. I was also curious, in the human medicine side, there is also this growing importance into technology playing a role, and all with all these medical devices and more advanced, which is another area that doctors need to be aware of. How much of that is playing a role veterinarian practice?
It does play a role, and I think it's often a necessary and beneficial role. We are typically quite a ways behind human medicine just because, again, of the resource issues. When I graduated, it was rare for a small animal private practitioner to have an ultrasound machine, and I was fortunate to learn to do ultrasound, and that was exceptional. Now it's quite common, and most students come out with at least a little familiarity with that technology. Still pretty uncommon to have a CT scanner, an MRI in your practice. You have to refer for that. I imagine in 10 more years, that technology will be more widely used. So I absolutely think that the adoption of new technologies gives us more treatment options and is beneficial from a medical perspective. I think that there are, as always, some downsides to that as well. Some of that, of course, is the cost, because the cost of care increases, and just as it does in human medicine. And unlike human medicine, very few of our patients have health insurance. Health insurance covers about 5% of my patients, and it's typically catastrophic care only, not well care. So people have to pay out of pocket for our services. And as our services get more expensive, more people are unable to access them. I do think also that we've seen in human medicine that sometimes technology can be a distraction from good quality human care. And I think the same can certainly happen in our field if we're not careful, if we're not looking at the patient, touching the patient, interacting with the owner in a way that is focused. And if we're distracted by the technology, that can sometimes diminish the quality of care. So I think we have to be mindful of that. It's a little less of a problem because we don't have as much access as rapidly to new technologies as in human medicine. And so we tend to still be a little more old school in how we approach the problems we have to deal with.
You mentioned about insurance. That was going to be my next question as well. That probably, especially in US, the healthcare system and the insurance probably is the most complex subject anybody can even begin to grasp. And that is something, even though human doctors, they don't do it themselves, they need to be aware of it. They need to learn, and that also brings in a lot of documentation work. How much of that is prevalent in veterinarian field?
Very little. As I said, the insurance is primarily catastrophic care. And I often do encourage people to think about having insurance and to explore that, because we have a phenomenon that doesn't exist in human medicine, which we call economic euthanasia. There are situations where animals may have fixable medical problems and people don't have the resources to fix them. And then the animal has to be put to sleep. And that's heartbreaking for everybody involved. And catastrophic care insurance can be an answer to that problem. So if your dog gets hit by a car or swallows something that has to be removed from them surgically, and that's $8,000, $10,000, $15,000, depending on where you live for care, and you have to pay that out of pocket, that may not be available for a lot of people. And insurance may make the difference between being able to treat that pet and not. So in that sense, I think it's a good thing. But it also is, like most insurance, something that you will hope to pay for forever and never need. and likely not something you'll get your investment back on in a financial way if everything goes well. From the bureaucratic point of view, there's very little interaction between insurance companies and veterinarian. Most insurance is set up so that the client pays the bill and the insurer reimburses them. And the most we have to do is provide copies of medical records so they can go through and understand. There's also much less regulation of insurance. There is some regulation, but for example, there's no bar to excluding pre-existing conditions. So a lot of people will get insurance after their pet has had a problem and then suddenly realize that the insurance will never cover treatment for that problem again. So people have to be very much buyer beware when they go into the insurance field, because it's quite different from medicine.
Now, coming to students who are in high school or younger people who are their heart set on veterinary field, what are some of the resources that you would recommend that would give them the most realistic view of the profession, balanced view of the profession? Do you have any recommendations for them to educate themselves, know more about the field?
The most important thing has always been to spend time in a veterinary practice. And in many places, it's still possible for young people to do volunteer or paid work as assistants in veterinary practices. And I think that's really critical. Even if for some reason it's not possible, it's a little less common for the local vet that knows everybody in their community to take in high school students. Sometimes big corporate practices are less amenable to that and more concerned about insurance and things. Even working as front office staff or in a support position allows you to be in the environment and to see what it looks like on a day-to-day basis. Because again, I think that it is a profession, unlike some, where there are ideas about what it is, and being a vet and a fireman and a policeman and a doctor are all things that we think about as kids and have fantasies about. And the best way to really understand if it's an environment you enjoy is to spend time in it. So I always encourage people to do that in whatever way you can. And then be aware that it is important that you do well in science and that you enjoy doing science, because you're going to spend a great deal of your academic career studying science. You don't necessarily have to be a pre-veterinary or biology major. We do get people from lots of other backgrounds, but you will spend a lot of time studying those things. And if you find that you absolutely hate it, could be a warning sign or a red flag. But realistically, spending as much time in that environment and seeing what it looks like is probably the best.
And finally, what would be your one last piece of advice to anybody who is exploring this as their possible profession?
I think the biggest piece of advice that I give young people about any kind of career search, and certainly if they're interested in veterinary medicine, is try to minimize your preconception and not be married to your vision of your future as something that you can predict and control well down the line. It's perfectly fine to have a direction to go in, but don't necessarily fixate on that to the exclusion of opportunities that arise along the way. There's an Australian musician and comedian, Tim Minchin, who is very suspicious of long-term goals. And he talks about being micro-ambitious, right? Put your heart and soul into what you're doing now, but don't become so fixated on the long-term goal that you miss the shiny thing out of the corner of your eye that might turn out to be the next opportunity. I have had many turning points in my pathway, and I could have been a physician, I could have been a primatologist, I could have been an English professor, I could have been lots of things. I think any of those would have been viable and satisfying careers. I'm a veterinarian, and that's a viable and satisfying career. And you have to be open to that kind of opportunity as you go along.
That is such a great advice, and true for a lot of, I feel like opportunity cost is a very important concept for somebody to master. Thank you so much, Brennen. It was amazing speaking with you and a lot of very useful information. Thank you for coming on my podcast and sharing that with people.
Thank you. I very much enjoyed it.
This is Career Calling, and I'm your host, Pratibha Pandit. For more contents like this, please don't forget to subscribe, leave a rating, or a comment. Thank you for tuning in.